Good morning. I'm Eric Lee, director of the Kimbell, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture for our great exhibition from the Phillips Collection. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Susan Behrends Frank, who specializes in European and American modernism and is a curator at the Phillips Collection. Sue earned her PhD in art history in 1996 from the University of Iowa, where she received the Distinguished Dissertation in the Humanities Award for her dissertation on Salvador Dali's and Louis Buñuel's two surrealist films, Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or. Since joining the Phillips in 2000, Sue has organized numerous exhibitions featuring the museum's superb holdings of modernist art. These include exhibitions on Hiroshige at the Phillips Collection in 2005, American Art and Early Film 2007, and Philip Guston from 2011. She has also curated exhibitions that showcase the brilliant acquisitions made by the collection's founder, Duncan Phillips, and in 2014 organized a significant installation of more than 200 works from the Phillips Collection titled Made in the USA. Sue has also organized numerous traveling exhibitions drawn from the Phillips holdings. These include, in addition to the great exhibition upstairs, her 2007 exhibition, American Impressionism, Paintings from the Phillips Collection, which traveled to 7 U.S. cities, and in 2010 to 13, the exhibition, American Art from the Phillips Collection, which you may have enjoyed at the Amon Carter. That exhibition traveled to 2 other venues in the U.S., as well as to Rovereto, Italy, Madrid, and Tokyo. Sue also curated Impressionist and Modern Masters paintings from the Phillips Collection, which was seen in Rome, Barcelona, and Madrid in 2015 and 16, as well as the exhibition American Mosaic, The Eye of Duncan Phillips, currently at the Brandywine River Museum, and traveling to Potsdam, Germany this summer. These exhibitions, which have been accompanied by various books, essays, and public lectures, speak to Sue Frank's deep knowledge and appreciation of the artworks of Duncan Phillips and the Phillips Collection. We welcome her to the podium today. Sue.
Good morning. Thank you all for showing up on such a beautiful Saturday morning. I really am thrilled to see so many of you here, and I hope that you have an opportunity, today, this weekend, and through the summer to enjoy this exhibition of our European masterworks that we have brought to you here at the Kimbell. And so my talk today is really something that I hope some of you have been to Washington to see the Phillips Collection, to have visited us there. On the screen here on the bottom, you see pictures of the Phillips Collection as it exists today. And if you haven't been to Washington recently, we have not only the original house that you see on the left, but we've expanded the annex that was built in 1960, and we've taken over this, what was an apartment building, and we have turned it into galleries and office space. So we're in a residential part of the city, and we've kind of expanded our footprint as much as we can right now. But Duncan Phillips, our founder, was born in Pittsburgh in 1886. You see this portrait of him on the left. And he died in Washington, D.C. in 1966, just shy of his 80th birthday. In 2017, the Phillips is celebrating its 96 years in Washington is a small private museum in the nation's capital, and it has been an integral part of the city and its cultural life since opening to the public in late 1921. Through Duncan Phillips' passion and determination, the Phillips Collection holds the distinction of many firsts for artists, exhibitions, and acquisitions that have contributed significantly to the cultural life of the nation and the Washington community for nearly 100 years now. My talk today is really about the boldness of Phillips' vision and the fearlessness he exhibited over 5 decades as he strove to define for himself and for American audiences an understanding of modernism in the first half of the 20th century. How he crafted this remarkable collection and made it come alive as an experiment station is the fascinating story of a man who gave his life over to his love for the art of his time and his determination to share that passion with the public. And so at the end of my talk, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So, here. So this is Duncan Phillips. He was a product of the progressive era in the United States and of the intellectual climate of pre-World War I New York. He was a romantic and a humanist who believed he could contribute to society and his community through the arts and art education. He was born into a wealthy Pittsburgh family and as the second son and the namesake of a glass manufacturer and his wife, who was the heir, one of the heirs, to the Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. So in 1897, the family moved to Washington, D.C. Duncan Phillips was 11, and the house you see in the center there was the retirement home of his parents. They built this Georgian-style mansion in the DuPont Circle neighborhood in the northwest part of the city. And so the young Duncan Phillips, he essentially grew up in the nation's capital. And as an adult, he was able to move easily among the city's political and social elite, most of whom actually lived in this same part of the city. But after graduating from Yale University in 1908, Phillips traveled with his family to Japan and China in 1910, and then in 1911 and 1912, on his own, he went to Europe to see the great European art museums. Then in 1912, he set out to make his way as an art critic in New York, where he and his older brother James began visiting galleries and artist studios, getting to know American artists whose work they bought for pleasure, while advising their parents on acquisitions of contemporary American art. A man of his time, Duncan Phillips shared a widespread American belief in the power of individuals to reshape and mold American life. Phillips returned to the family home in Washington in late 1918 to care for his widowed mother, following the sudden death of his older brother during the Spanish influenza outbreak. He found himself in the nation's capital at a time of tremendous national celebration and relief that the Great War had come to an end. Phillips, with his mother's support, re-envisioned transforming what had been a shared family passion for collecting contemporary American painting into something far more ambitious. It was a museum that he was thinking about that would be in the nation's capital and dedicated to modern art and the work of artists from all quarters, where visitors could see art of the new century in the company of well-known masterpieces. Now, in 1918, the nation's capital had only 2 museums, the Corcoran Gallery of Art and what we now know as the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And each of them had a decided preference for representational American pictures, not for abstract art of any persuasion. Washington was certainly not alone in its resistance to introducing modern art of either European or American origin into America's museums, for it would be yet another decade before the Museum of Modern Art was established in New York in 1929, with its express mission to feature the work of living artists and define modernism for the public. Thus, the territory that Phillips staked out as his life's work was uncharted at the end of the second decade of the 20th century. And although one might think that a bit intimidating, it was actually very liberating, because it allowed Phillips to create a museum unfettered by expectation. So on the screen, you see a photograph here on the right of Duncan Phillips that was taken in the summer of 1921, when he was planning for his new museum in the last stages. He was 35 years old. Christened the Phillips Memorial Gallery in tribute to his late father and brother, the new museum opened to the public in late 1921, and within a few years, Phillips began calling it a museum of modern art and its sources. The museum that bore his family name was his own best effort to be, and I'm going to quote him here, a beneficent force in the community where I live, because art is part of the social purpose of the world. So in less than 3 years from the gallery's inception to its public opening in late fall 21, Phillips acquired 237 works. A June 1921 inventory includes works by Chardin, Puvis de Chavannes, John Constable, Gustave Courbet, Honoré Daumier, Claude Monet, and Alfred Sisley. And on the screen here on the far left, you see a photograph from 1922 of Duncan Phillips and his new wife, Marjorie Acker. It was taken in the main gallery with, you see behind Marjorie's head is the Chardin bowl of plums that's here at the Kimbell. A Corot figure in the center, and then Daumier's 3 lawyers, also here at the Kimbell. All of these pictures were acquired between 1918 and 1920. Phillips listed the Chardin still life as one of his best purchases of 1918-19 in the list you also see on the screen. In fact, during these early years, Phillips was an inveterate list maker. It was a way for him to kind of prioritize his ideas about specifically desired works and/or artists that he wanted to include in the collection. From the outset, Phillips envisioned that he would seek out major masterworks from the past to be the foundation of the museum. He never sought to establish a comprehensive survey of styles or movements. Rather, he looked for what he called rivers of artistic purpose. From the beginning, the collection was predicated on the dynamic relationship between past and present. And so the Phillips Collection has always articulated the values that made possible the modern museum of art, never separating artists by time, nationality, or geography. Phillips established the precedent that continues to this day of showing American modernist works alongside European art. He saw the two as equals capable of coexisting in a very easy relationship, and this was a revolutionary approach for a museum at this time. So on the screen, you see this 1927 installation, but I'm really showing it to you because I want you to get a sense of what the main gallery looked like at this time. So Phillips' innovative exhibition strategy was put into action right at the beginning of the museum. He never intended to exhibit his entire collection at once. Instead, he presented his paintings, and I'm quoting him here, in ever varied and purposeful exhibitions, which are frequently changed so that the walls of the various rooms reveal interesting transformations. So the arrangement on the screen is from 1927, and it is the room, a skylit gallery designed by the New York architects McKim, Mead, and White that was added to the family home in 1920. So when Phillips established the museum at the end of 1918, he fully intended to build a separate museum structure at some point in the future. But in 1919, he was really anxious to get started. And so not only did he begin rapidly acquiring works for the collection, but he chose to build the family's already planned picture gallery addition to the home and make it the museum's temporary space. He called it the main gallery, and it was and is the principal exhibition space that we still have. It's our historical space at the museum. So while the family lived in the house through the 1920s, this was the primary exhibition space. So in 1922, this photograph on the left, late 1922, shows Duncan and Marjorie in this wood-paneled large library we now call the music room. And this room is directly below that main gallery. So celebrating their first wedding anniversary coincided with the first anniversary of the museum. And so that's probably one of the things that prompted this photo session. But they are pictured here in front of El Greco's Repentance St. Peter, a work from about 1600 that was newly acquired that September of 1922 and was at that moment the most significant work in the collection. And so on the screen is a 1923 installation in the main gallery, that principal exhibition space. And you see in the center of this wall that I'm showing you the newly acquired El Greco, given its first prominent public presentation. Its significance for the collection and for the community was highlighted by the Washington newspapers. It is given a place of honor in the main gallery. The El Greco you see flanked on one side by works by the Italian Baroque master Alessandro Magnasco, and then to the left of that, the 19th century French realist Gustave Courbet, landscape. And on the other side of the El Greco are contemporary works by the Americans Ernest Lawson, Julian Alden Weir, Robert Spencer, and John Henry Twatman, works that all date from the 1890s to 1920. Phillips' budding views on collecting and displaying art are revealed here in that he understood from the outset that both practices, collecting and displaying, are artistic endeavors that require vision and creativity. A guiding principle from the beginning in the gallery's installations, or arrangements, as Phillips called them, was, and I'm quoting him here, for the purpose of contrast and analogy, to bring together congenial spirits from the artists from different parts of the world and from different periods of time, and trace their common descent from old masters who anticipated modern ideas. Thus, I demonstrate two things: the antiquity of modern ideas, or, if you prefer, the modernity of some of the old masters. And I prove in our main gallery and its union of old masters and modern painters that art is a universal language which defies classification according to any chronological or national order. And I just point out that this is such a different philosophy than the Museum of Modern Art under the first director, Alfred Barr, who saw modernism as a break from the past, where Duncan Phillips saw modernism as a continuation of older ideas. So exhibitions or arrangements were as important to Phillips' strategy of defining modernism as were his acquisitions. And by 1926, he articulated his firm belief that the Phillips Collection was, in essence, a laboratory for modernism, writing that it was an intimate museum combined with an experiment station, where new artists of all kinds were being tested by the great things in the collection. The independence of Phillips' arrangements and exhibitions became a hallmark of the museum's adventurous programming, and it continues to shape installations at the museum today. And on the screen, you see one of Phillips's later installations in the main gallery, this one from 1960 that brings together contemporary American and French painting with a Cubist still life from 1913 and a Modigliani portrait from 1917, because on the far left, that Carl Knott's Pine Timber is a contemporary American work. And Phillips often liked to bring that Knott's picture into conversation with the de Staël painting, the Parc de Sceaux. So in 1921, Phillips may have been new to the challenge of creating a museum and assembling a world-class collection, but he was not naive. He had a clear vision from the earliest years that he needed to seek out works of exceptional quality, especially by the acknowledged masters. So by 1913, he was even thinking that maybe his museum should become an American Prado, and those are his words, which would be an historical proving ground that was similar to the great Spanish museum where working artists could be inspired. In 1923, the museum became the proud possessor of Renoir's 1881 masterwork, The Luncheon of the Boating Party, which became a statement to the world of Phillips' lofty aspirations. This was a painting that Phillips had been captivated by since he had first seen it in Paris in 1911. And with this single purchase, just 18 months after the Phillips Memorial Gallery had opened, Duncan Phillips put his fledgling collection on the map, and he set a course for the future. Writing to the critic Guy Pendubois in December of 1923, "I could get lesser examples, which would give great satisfaction. But for such an American Prado as I am planning, there must be nothing but the best." Phillips understood with a marketer's sensibility that if he could acquire such an internationally well-known painting, people would make pilgrimages to his museum, where they would not only see that painting, but others. And so it's interesting that the arrival of the Renoir in Washington was picked up and celebrated in the New York papers as well. So on the screen is the 1954 picture of Duncan and Marjorie in the main gallery with the Renoir. And then I show you a 1930 installation that features the Renoir with, as you go from the Renoir, it's a Bonnard, there's a Gauguin landscape, a Behrends painting, Cezanne, and then you see the El Greco. So nearly 100 years after it was acquired, Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, it still fascinates and it lures visitors to our museum, just as Phillips imagined it would do. So the 1920s, it was a decade of active buying and significant acquisitions. Among 19th century French paintings, Phillips showed a marked preference for landscape, the predominant subject of many of the great artists whose work he would collect. Even before the museum opened, he'd acquired several classic French Impressionist paintings. 2 works by Monet that you see on the screen here, the Road to Vittoy in the center, and on the far right, the Rapids of the Creuse. Both of these Monets were listed on that list of best purchases from 1918-19. And then also, in the June 1921 inventory are 2 works by Alfred Sisley that were listed but were later deaccessioned. So a third Sisley, the Snow at Louveciennes that you see on the left that is in the exhibition, was purchased in 1923, and it was the only one that Phillips kept. Monet's Impressionist landscapes were also revisited in the 1920s, and Phillips chose only to keep the Road de Vittoy that you see here, which he believed captured the essence of Monet as a great colorist and a poet of light. In Sisley's work, Phillips saw a connection to English poetry, calling Snow at Louveciennes a lyric of winter, enchanting both in its mood and its tonality of tenderly described values. This culling in the 1920s of the museum's Impressionist landscape group is testament to Phillips' developing eye for assessing an artist's work and his increased understanding that he was making choices for more than just his own personal enjoyment. He was building a museum collection, just as a curator would. In 1926, he wrote that he would, and I quote him here, "create a collection of pictures, laying every block in place with a vision of the whole, exactly as the artist builds his monument or his decoration." Phillips was convinced that a collector must develop his own individual taste and know which artist he admires and why. He understood that his museum collection was not just one of these and one of those, but an ongoing process of choice and refinement. 30 years after deaccessioning Monet's Rapids of the Creuse, Phillips finally found the perfect pendant to the late afternoon view that is the Road to Vittoy. It is this 1897 picture you see on the right of the Val Saint-Nicolas near Dieppe, morning, where all of the individual contours of the landscape are lost in this ambience of light and atmosphere. Phillips had searched for such a work for many years, buying and selling 4 others in the 20s and 30s before discovering this one in 1959, a work he believed to be one of the most beautiful Monets he had ever seen. Phillips' preference for landscape painting continued in 1924 and 25 with his acquisitions of two outstanding landscapes by Gustave Courbet, the Mediterranean on the left here and rocks at Moutier in the center, as well as constables on the River Stour, that's the far right. Phillips recognized the vigor and independence of Courbet's elemental and non-literary vision. Constable, in Phillips' view, was the foil to Courbet. Phillips preferred Constable's sketches, such as this one that you see on the River Stour, rather than the artist's finished presentation works. Because Phillips considered Constable's sketches, and I'm quoting here, at least 50 years ahead of their time in their full employment of all the emotional capacities of color. Building the core foundation of the museum's modern masters was very much part of Phillips' mission in the 20s. He took seriously his own self-education about the arts and read the leading critics of the day, especially the works of Roger Fry and Clive Bell, whose writings about post-impressionism and contemporary French art provided him with the intellectual framework for considering the aesthetic foundation of modern art. By 1925, Phillips was intellectually ready to buy his first canvas by Paul Cezanne. At the time, very few American museums owned works by Cezanne, who had only died in 1906 and was still considered too avant-garde by conservative critics and the public in the United States. The first Cezanne to enter the collection was this 1886 landscape, the Mont Saint-Victoire, which Phillips acquired in 1925. But it's fascinating to also consider that in that same year, Phillips bought not only the first Cezanne for the collection, but his first Gauguin for the collection. This 1901 South Seas fantasy that is titled The Idol of Tahiti, which you see on the screen. What two vastly different landscapes they are, but they speak to Phillips' growing understanding of the roots of the modernist aesthetic. Notably, when Phillips chose to make Cezanne a cornerstone artist of the collection, he deaccessioned Gauguin's Tahiti canvas in the mid-1930s, trading it for Goya's 1820 work of the repentant St. Peter. So it wasn't until 1951 that Phillips inserted Gauguin back into the collection. He chose differently this time, however, not this overtly romantic and exotic Gauguin of Tahiti, but a brilliant Brittany still life from 1889 titled The Ham. Phillips was no doubt drawn to this still life by its color and design, its decorative forms, and its vibrant colors. And he wrote to the dealer Paul Rosenberg in 1951, from whom he purchased it, that it was essential to have it because it had such a resemblance to the collection and is so much needed as a source of subsequent painting. So while Gauguin could be represented by a single work, Cezanne required more in-depth representation in the collection. So 3 years after buying his first Cezanne, Phillips acquired one of the artist's self-portraits from the late 1870s. 20 years earlier, this very portrait had been deemed too modern for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and it had gone on to find its place in several German private collections before Phillips had his opportunity to purchase it in 1928. With this acquisition, the Phillips Collection became the very first American museum to own a self-portrait by Cezanne. And in 1931, Phillips wrote proudly of how it was considered one of the finest Cezannes in the world. He often compared it to the Rembrandt's self-portraits and declared that if disaster were ever to befall the museum, this is the painting he would tuck under his arm as he went out the door. Phillips' growing appreciation of Cezanne in the mid-1920s informed, refined, and educated his eye while broadening his vision of modern art. As early as 1926, Phillips expressed the need for a Cezanne still life, but over the years he refused several offers, relying strictly on his vision of a work that would be suitable within the context of the growing collection. In 1939, he found this monumental still life, ginger pot with pomegranate and pears that you see on the screen that is also in the exhibition. It was once owned by Claude Monet, and it recalls the luminous arrangements of Chardin that Phillips so admired. And after seeing this painting at Wildenstein's in New York, Phillips borrowed it for an exhibition before ultimately arranging for his nephew to acquire it and make a gift of it back to the collection. 2 additional Cezannes were acquired in the 1940s, but the culmination of the Cezanne unit at the Phillips is the garden at Les Louvres that you see on the right. It is a late work that Phillips acquired in 1955, 30 years after buying his first Cezanne. Probably Phillips' eye was not yet ready in the 1920s for the abstract nature of this late work, which captures everything about Cezanne's working method and his reduction of the landscape to its basic elements. The group of 6 Cezanne oils that Phillips assembled from 1925 to 1955 remains a cornerstone of the collection today, and we're thrilled to be able to share 3 of them with you here at the Kimbell. Honoré Daumier is another of the great 19th century modern masters that Phillips identified for the collection as soon as he began his museum project. A keen observer of human nature and a forceful satirist, Daumier occupied the highest place in Duncan Phillips' pantheon of artists. Phillips saw him as a mystic, a romantic poet, and a technical experimenter far in advance of his age. The 3 Lawyers you see on the far left was acquired in 1920 and was the first of 7 oils and 50 works on paper by the artist that Phillips purchased over several decades. One of Phillips' most prized acquisitions, The Uprising from 1848 in the center here, it is the largest painting by Daumier in North America. Phillips acquired it in 1925, a time when Daumier was most valued for his caricatures, not for his paintings. Phillips acted quickly as soon as this painting became available through a London dealer in 1924, beating out the Louvre that was left considering whether to purchase it. The acquisition of this historic picture signaled Phillips' deep response to works that deal with the human condition. He gave the picture boundless praise, writing, "The Uprising is not only one of the greatest paintings of the 19th century, but of all time. The titanic genius of its plastic power is worthy of comparison with Rembrandt and Michelangelo." In 1927, Phillips announced that he wanted his Daumier unit to be second to none and of worldwide fame and importance, a goal he pursued over several decades. Today, the 7 Daumier paintings in the collection encompass some 25 years of the artist's work, making one of the finest representations of Daumier as a painter in America. And early in June, we'll have 3 Daumiers here for you at the Kimbell. This strong man that you see on the right screen here is currently in a Seurat show in New York at the Met, but it will be making a late arrival here in Fort Worth. As the acquisition of the great Daumier reveals, collecting is equal parts collector awareness and receptivity combined with serendipity. In assessing the state of the collection in 1926, Phillips wrote that he needed a figure painting or a still life by Edouard Manet, as well as a scene from the racetrack or the ballet by Gogh. 2 years later, he succeeded on both counts. He purchased his first and only oil by Manet, the Spanish Ballet of 1862, and also his first ballet picture by Gogh, the Ballet Rehearsal of 1885. Both were acquired from the same French Impressionist dealer who had sold him the great Renoir, and also to Monet's. Drawn to Edouard Manet's early Spanish-themed works, which Phillips identified as desired on a 1922 wish list, few of these were available, of course, but Phillips patiently waited for his opportunity to buy this picture from the Durand-Ruel private collection, where he had first seen it in Paris as a young man. Although Phillips had acquired a Gogh by 1921, he did not keep it for long. The Ballet Rehearsal of 1885 was the real masterwork he desired. 24 years after acquiring it, he gave it to the Yale University Art Gallery, his alma mater, Yale, when they were planning their new Louis Kahn-designed building and asking alums to go and contribute, to this effort. And so the sacrifice that Phillips chose to give one of the major works in his collection, it speaks to Phillips' generosity and his willingness to do his part for other institutions who were trying to grow their collections. But here you see on the screen that by 1952, Phillips had assembled an in-depth group of Degas' works, acquiring the 4 paintings you see on the screen in the 1940s that capture the diversity of this important 19th century artist, including the monumental late ballet picture Dancers at the Bar, which is in the exhibition. While Duncan Phillips was particularly sensitive to Degas' colorful and expressive style and recognized the impressionist qualities of his works, he also saw and admired those aspects that distinguished Degas from the larger group of impressionist painters. And that is a stress on line, which Phillips likened to that of Holbein and Botticelli, and a use of formal compositions which Phillips thought echoed Japanese works. Now, many important source works for the collection were not actually acquired until the 40s and 50s, decades when Duncan Phillips was very actively buying contemporary art. These later acquisitions include this exquisite small bather by Ingres that Phillips sought as a foil to Delacroix's very romantic vision of the violinist Paganini in concert. This Delacroix that you see on the left had been in the collection since 1922. In the 1940s, 2 additional small Delacroix oils were added to the collection, including the one you see in the center here, Horses Coming Out of the Sea, which is a late Delacroix that Phillips recognized as, and I'm quoting him here, a rare combination of the classic and romantic. And although examples of Corot's figure painting had been acquired in the 1920s, in 1922 and again in 1955, Phillips had opportunity to purchase 3 small Corot landscape views, works that signaled the artist's genius for capturing light and atmosphere. And 2 of them are in the exhibition. The view from the Farnese Gardens, Rome, that you see on the right, is a morning view of the church of San Sebastiano in Palatino that was painted by Corot in the 1820s, during Corot's first stay in Italy. While Genzano, the landscape on the left, dates from Corot's 3rd and last trip to Italy in 1843. Now, from first to last, Phillips felt an intense response to the role of color in works of art. In the 1920s, he discovered an astonishing colorist in the French painter Pierre Bonnard, initiating a great romance with the artist's work that would continue throughout Phillips' life as a collector. In Bonnard, Phillips recognized an heir to Renoir. So on the screen on the left is Bonnard's Woman with Dog, and on the right, The Early Spring. These are the first 2 Bonnards that Phillips acquired for the collection, both purchased in 1925 from the Carnegie International Exhibition in Pittsburgh. Now, artist and patron, they met the following year in 1926 when Bonnard came to Washington as a juror with the Carnegie International, and he wanted to meet this collector who had acquired his work the previous year. And so a friendship was established that lasted till Bonnard's death in 1947. So while other major institutions in the 1930s, like the Museum of Modern Art, viewed Bonnard as a latter-day impressionist and paid him absolutely no attention at all, Phillips chose to collect Bonnard's work in depth, keeping to his belief that an artist must be true to himself, even if that puts him outside current conventions. Between 1925 and 1954, Phillips acquired a group of 17 paintings by Bonnard that remains unrivaled in America, and 4 of them are in this exhibition. Now, Bonnard may have been the first of the School of Paris artists that Phillips acquired in that decade after World War I, but he was certainly not the the last. In a very short time, from 1925 to 1930, Phillips acquired more than 50 works by School of Paris artists, making the Phillips Collection the only American museum actively acquiring the work of the French moderns in the 1920s. Many of these artists are represented in the exhibition here at the Kimbell, such as Georges Braque, Henri Matisse, Aristide Maillol, Pablo Picasso, Marie Trio, and Jacques Villon. Not until the establishment of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929 would New York have a voice in the modernist revolution to rival that of the Phillips Collection. Now, this shift in the mid-1920s represents a clear change in Phillips' thinking about modernism and contemporary art. In early 1925, he resigned from the Conservative American Federation of Arts, writing to them, "I have changed my mind as to the proper attitude towards experimental work in painting and sculpture. I now believe that it is only fair to the artists who are doing this necessary pioneer service to try to understand their often vague intentions and their gallant desire to invent. It is the duty of the patron of art to be alert and open-minded and to encourage adventurous creators through helpful cooperation with their efforts." By the end of 1926, Phillips was referring to his museum as an experiment station or laboratory, where new artists of all kinds were being tested by the great things in the collection. And Phillips was willing to make mistakes, and I'm quoting him here, he was willing to learn from his mistakes in this task of searching for talent. Phillips' stated aim was not just to exhibit, but to interpret. His commitment to the idea of the experiment station as exhibition strategy was boldly placed on view in February 1927 in this installation shot that you see, when he initiated what was his first, he called it a tri-unit exhibition that expanded the public galleries in the house to include 3 rooms, because one room was no longer enough to experiment with his collection. The theme of this main gallery installation you see on the screen was sensibility and simplification in ancient sculpture and contemporary painting. And it brought together in one space on equal terms modern French painting and contemporary American art. So on the right side are the watercolors by the American John Marin, and they are opposite works by the contemporary French moderns. You can see just a corner here on the very far left of that screen is just a corner of the Bonnard Early Spring. You can see that nursemaid there, and that's how we've been able to figure out what that is. Next to it is a still life by Matisse. Then the exhibition also included Honoré Daumier de Sagonzac, Maurice Trio, and Edouard Vuillard. Anchoring the wall between these 2 walls was a vertical canvas by the American Augustus Vincent Tack. And on either side of the tack one side had the newly acquired Mont Saint-Victoire landscape by Cezanne, and then this double hang of 2 pictures, the one below was thought to be a Seurat at the time, and on the left side of the tack were 2 American paintings, one by Maurice Prendergast and the other by John Henry Twatman. In fact, that Twatman painting was one that Bonnard had singled out as an American artist that he knew nothing about but was very interested in when he had visited the collection in 1926. And I want to emphasize here that although my talk is focused on the development of the European collection and how it reflects Duncan Phillips' eye for modern art, he was simultaneously collecting art by young, unknown American artists like Arthur Dove, Georgia O'Keeffe, John Marin, Milton Avery, Charles Sheeler, and others, whose works were far less generally sought after than the new American painting being done in France. And as a former Phillips colleague once described it, Phillips was carrying water on both shoulders, championing both contemporary American art and European modernism at the same time. Now, in February 1927, Phillips wrote a letter to the New York Herald Tribune, and he confidently proposed that his innovative approach should be a model for other museums, especially the Metropolitan Museum of Art. With no New York museum in the 1920s committed to the work of living artists, Phillips was outspoken in his belief that an institution like the Met should follow his example and set aside a space, a curator, and a small purchase fund, and I'm going to quote here, to experiment with vital works of art. Now, Matisse's place in the collection was never in doubt after Phillips acquired his first painting by the artist in early 1927, the 1918-19 still life that you see on the screen in black and white here. It was included in that February 1927 installation I just showed you. A few months later, however, Phillips traded that still life for the one on the right, called Anemones with a Black Mirror, but from the same moment in Matisse's oeuvre. 3 years later, in 1930, Matisse himself visited the museum as a member of the jury for the Carnegie International exhibition, and he experienced firsthand the range of works in Phillips' revolutionary museum in Washington. Matisse took particular interest in the examples of American painting in the collection, and he admired the 5 Bonnards that were then hanging in the galleries, assuring Phillips that Bonnard was, and this is a quote from Matisse according to Marjorie Phillips, that Bonnard was the best of us all. And this is a view that certainly was shared by Phillips and Matisse, but it was certainly not a view shared by collectors or critics on either side of the Atlantic at the time. For Phillips, however, Matisse was the counterpoint to Bonnard's emotive and Dionysian color contrasts. Phillips responded especially to Matisse's sensuous decorative powers, writing that Matisse was a daring and lucid agitator for direct decorative expression and luminous chromatic experiment, the brilliant descendant of a great Oriental tradition. Now, Phillips kept this extraordinary still life, the Anemones with Black Mirror, for 20 years before he reluctantly gave it up, along with 3 other works, in order to obtain Georges Rouault's Portrait of Verlaine from 1947, or in 1947. And this work by Rouault was something that Phillips believed essential for the collection. Rouault had become a favorite of Phillips in the 1930s, and Phillips believed him to be a great visionary. So between 1931 and 1955, Phillips purchased 17 Rouault paintings, and then he curated that in-depth group down to 7. So this painting of Verlaine was one that he was absolutely believed essential to that group of Rouaults, and it is included in the Kimbell exhibition. So now, trading one work for another in order to continue to refine the collection had been part of Phillips' curatorial philosophy from the outset. But Phillips did not have the deep pockets of a Getty or a Mellon. So after 1929, he also had to make sacrifices in order to add more masterworks to the collection. And sometimes such difficult curatorial decisions contribute to an awareness of how less can ultimately be more. So although he gave up Matisse's Anemones with Black Mirror, and that was a difficult decision, Phillips believed it necessary. The dealer for that trade purchase was Pierre Matisse, the son of the artist who had established a gallery in New York. Phillips and the younger Matisse had become acquainted in 1940 when Phillips acquired this grand painting that you see on the screen here. It was one of Matisse's great early masterworks, the 1916 Studio Quai Saint-Michel. This painting is rarely loaned, it's very large, and it will be a late arrival here at the Kimbell. It is currently on view in San Francisco in a Diebenkorn Matisse exhibition. So within 2 years of securing the Rouault Verlaine, Phillips had an opportunity to purchase a late Matisse still life, the 1948 masterwork called Interior with Egyptian Curtain. This picture made its U.S. debut at Pierre Matisse's New York gallery in February 1949, where Phillips immediately sought it for the collection. Soon after, he received a letter from Pierre Matisse that said, and I'm quoting, "I know that the artist himself would have every consideration if he knew that you were interested in the painting and wished to include it in your collection." Thus did Phillips reconstitute his Matisse unit with two great masterworks by this French 20th century artist, one from the artist's renowned World War I period, and the other a late work connected to his cutouts. And I just love this Henri Cartier-Bresson photograph of Matisse in his studio in 1948 with this painting on the studio wall. Now, Georges Braque's classic post-war still lifes captivated Phillips at the same time as Phillips was captivated by the works of Bonnard and Matisse. Braque's post-war still lifes changed the look of pre-war analytical cubism. And Phillips' 1927 purchase of Braque's Plums, Pears, Nuts, and Knife, the long painting on the bottom left there, marked the very first American Museum acquisition for this contemporary French painter, and it was the beginning of Phillips' lifelong passion for Braque's work. With a special emphasis on the artist's still lifes of the 1920s, Phillips assembled a Braque unit that consists of 13 oils by the artist that spans 30 years of Braque's career. How different from the first Picasso that Phillips acquired, which is the 1901 Blue Room that you see on the screen. That Picasso was purchased by Phillips in 1927. Same year he was purchasing his first Matisse and Braque paintings. But Phillips passed over Picasso's recent work to reach back 25 years to when the artist was first in Paris. So while Phillips responded to the emotional essence of this work, he remained suspicious of Picasso's endless stylistic innovations. So on the screen, you see two monumental Braque and Picasso works that captured Phillips' attention in March 1934 when they were featured in a New York gallery show that showed the works of the French dealer Paul Rosenberg, who had brought many of his works to New York. So from that presentation, Phillips bought a Matisse still life. And then he had his eye on these two paintings, the Braque's Round Table and Picasso's Three Musicians. Ultimately, Phillips chose Braque's monumental 1929 canvas, not the Picasso. But Phillips had a second opportunity to buy this Picasso in 1941, and he even tried it out in the main gallery through a loan from the dealer, Paul Rosenberg. But the results were the same. Somehow, for Phillips, this Picasso did not fit in the collection. And so today it lives at the Museum of Modern Art. So in 1937, Phillips did acquire Picasso's dramatic bullfight of 1934. And so although Phillips found Picasso's work impersonal, and that may have been part of his difficulty with the Three Musicians, the expressive quality of the bullfight and the dramatic way that Picasso translates the polarities of life and death in its highly colored image of ferocious intensity deeply impressed Phillips, who purchased it soon after seeing it in a New York gallery. But notably, the next year, 1938, he went back and he bought Picasso's 1905 bronze, The Gesture, once again returning to that early period of Picasso's career that he seemed to prefer. By contrast, Phillips continued to pursue works for his Braque unit well into the 1950s, adding the washstand on the left here in 1948, the shower in the center in 1953, as well as the grand still life, the philodendron, that same year. Phillips, in fact, especially celebrated the arrival of the philodendron at the museum in 1953 by having the well-known photographer Naomi Savage come down from New York to record both Duncan and his wife with their newest Braque in the galleries. Now, to step back in time a bit, by 1930, Phillips' collection had grown to over 600 works. So even though he had expanded to 3 gallery spaces in the house in 1927, there was clearly not enough space to display the works in his purposeful arrangements. So either Phillips was going to have to build a separate museum structure, as he had planned to do when he started this journey, or he needed to build himself another residence. He had a growing family and a growing collection, and he chose to build himself another residence. In 1923, Phillips asserted that his museum should differ from most others in its informality, with a goal, as he wrote, to make the museum an intimate place where visitors will feel inclined to linger and which they will wish to return to for art's own special pleasure. That the family residence ultimately became the museum's final home by 1930 is a product not only of a changed financial portfolio, but also of Phillips' growing realization that the domestic spaces of the house created a very special place for visitors to experience the art in an intimate and personal way. In 1930, Phillips celebrated the opening of the house as his museum by making a major purchase, Vincent van Gogh's Public Garden at Arles, the first painting by Van Gogh to enter the collection. An article in the Washington Sunday Star announced the opening of the entire house and the first opportunity for Washingtonians to see this painting by Van Gogh, which had also been shown the year before at the opening of the opening exhibition of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. As our former chief curator has actually written, it's hardly surprising that Van Gogh's entrance to the public gardens at Arles was shown at both museums so close in time. For these two collections had very similar missions at this moment, with the first statement of purpose for the newly opened Museum of Modern Art in 1929, echoing Phillips' own purpose in establishing a collection of immediate ancestors of the modern movement. Thus, Phillips was also a natural choice as a founding member of the Museum of Modern Art's Board of Trustees. Another 20 years would pass before opportunity to add additional Van Goghs to the collection struck. The road menders that you see in the center here from 1889 and the house at Auvers from 1890 on the far right were owned by a longtime Phillips family friend who wished to sell them in 1949. Phillips seized that opportunity, and the result is an ideal Van Gogh group that we have at the Phillips that includes a work from each location of the artist's mature life, a major painting from Arles, a major one from Saint-Rémy, and a major one from the last weeks when he lived in Auvers. By 1940, the reality of war closing Europe off from America had a profound impact on Phillips' acquisitions, as he increasingly associated French painting with a vulnerable, expressive vision. Soutine, an expressionist painter born in 1893 in Lithuania to a poor Jewish family, was befriended in Paris by Modigliani. By 1922, Soutine's work was beginning to catch the eye of a few American collectors, like Albert Barnes in Philadelphia. But Duncan Phillips waited to make his first Soutine acquisitions in 1940-43, the last years of the artist's life, when Soutine's work was increasingly appreciated in the United States. In January 1943, the Phillips Collection hosted Soutine's one-person exhibition, the artist's first museum presentation in America. And although the show received mixed reviews in Washington, where one critic deemed the work, and I'm quoting, thoroughly repellent, Phillips sustained his commitment to Soutine, who for him represented, and I'm quoting Phillips here, the nervous agitation of the modern mind in a period of social conflict and war. The pheasant that you see on the left here, a Soutine work from 1926-27, was Phillips' very last Soutine acquisition, bringing to 4 the number of oils that he collected from 1940 to 1951. It is the earliest Soutine in the collection, and it is considered the artist's most sophisticated approach to the dead fowl and carcass theme, a tradition that extends back through old masters such as Chardin, Rembrandt, and Goya. In this one painting, Phillips saw Soutine living up to his gifts, his ambitions, and discoveries, self-prescribed artistic standards that were paramount in Phillips' mature judgment. In 1949, at almost the same time that he was negotiating that purchase of Matisse's interior with Egyptian curtain, Phillips was also arranging to buy from Pierre Matisse the only Modigliani in the collection, this captivating portrait of the French artist and patron Elena Pavlovsky, which is one of two portraits the Modigliani painted of her in 1917 in exchange for her financial and material support. Phillips was thrilled to add such an important Modigliani portrait to the collection, having believed for 2 decades that the opportunity might never materialize, as Modigliani had died in 1920, just when Phillips was beginning his museum project. Writing to the New York dealer Pierre Matisse, Phillips marveled that it is almost impossible to find Modiglianis of this quality on the market anywhere. Now, given Phillips' esteemed reputation in the art world in the 1930s and 40s, it was natural that Catherine Dreyer, one of the most avant-garde collectors in America and founder of the Société Anonyme, held Phillips in high regard. They met in New York in 1941. In 1949, Phillips gave the Société Anonyme one painting each by the Americans Dove and Marin. The following year, Phillips purchased this Grease painting that you see, the 1916 canvas, Still Life with Newspaper. He purchased it from Dreyer ostensibly to help her raise funds for the Société. 20 years earlier, Phillips had actually acquired a small 1915 Cubist abstraction by Grease, but this 1916 canvas was a far more ambitious example and one of Grease's true masterworks, a seminal example of what has been called essential cubism that speaks to this experimental pre-war works of Picasso and Braque. Now, the respect that Dreyer had for Phillips ran deep. She died just 2 years after Phillips purchased the Grease painting, but she left Phillips a bequest in her will that allowed him to have anything from her collection that he wanted. There were 41 major works, and he chose 17 that he believed belonged in the collection and that he said he would eagerly have purchased if he had had the chance. So on the screen, you see Franz Marc's Deer in the Forest 1 and Kandinsky's sketch for Painting with White Border, that are two of the great paintings that Phillips chose for the collection from her collection. And this is the only work by Franz Marc that we have in the collection. And this is the third and the last Kandinsky that Phillips added to his own collection. Now, quite clearly, Phillips' collecting of European modernism between the wars centered mostly on French painting, although in a very highly selective manner. Yet during the 1930s, Phillips also gained access to Expressionism through the work of Oskar Kokoschka and Paul Klee, and in the 1940s, he added works by Lionel Feininger, Kandinsky, and Piet Mondrian, among others. Now, the Klee unit is one of the cornerstones of the Phillips collection, and it was assembled between 1938 and 1948, with the exception of one early purchase in 1930, the tree nursery that you see here, the second from the right, that is also in the exhibition. This was Phillips' first work, when he bought the tree nursery, by a German-speaking artist. The Klee unit at the Phillips, when Phillips died, was composed of 13 works that he had assembled. And they are exampled, drawn from Klee's mature career that is after World War I. But the subjects all reflect Klee's far-flung interests and his admiration for non-Western art. And Phillips probably came to know Klee's work through the 1930 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Phillips was not immediately appreciative of Klee's theories, but he preferred the imaginative creativity of Klee's work. When planning the museum in the early 1920s, Phillips had envisioned creating individual rooms devoted to a single artist. And so in 1948, he established the Clay Room at the Phillips in a small, featureless gallery on the second floor of the house that actually had once been his mother's sewing room. The works remained in that singular space until the museum underwent renovations in 1985. And so when one went into that room, it was like entering a world of Clay's own measure and dimension. A world where Phillips wrote, he said, "Clay builds himself a little house of art in a realm somewhere between childhood's innocence and every man's prospect of infinity." Now, in the 1930s, Phillips placed Oskar Kokoschka in an expressionist lineage that began with El Greco and extended to the present day. He purchased a first work by this artist in 1938, one of the city views of Prague that you see on the left screen. This is from Kokoschka's Painted World series that the artist began in 1924. Two more Kokoschka acquisitions followed in 1941. The diaphanous portrait of Lottie Franzos from 1909, an early Kokoschka, and another example from the Painted World series, Courmayeur et les Dents des Géants, a 1927 canvas that is also in the current exhibition. The Kokoschka unit at the Phillips is 2 portraits, 4 landscapes, and 2 series of lithographs. And it is one of the most comprehensive surveys of the artist's work in the United States. Phillips never deaccessioned or traded any of the Kokoschka paintings, identifying Kokoschka as one of his favorite artists of the 20th century. After World War II, Phillips initiated a correspondence with Kokoschka, and in 1948, Phillips hosted a large traveling retrospective of the artist's work that was the artist's first American retrospective. Inspired by the tour's success, Kokoschka visited Washington, D.C., where he charmed visitors at the Phillips Collection. And that visit initiated a long friendship between Kokoschka and Phillips, who both shared a passionate belief in the artist as visionary. In the work of Kokoschka and Clay, Phillips saw the potential for perpetuating 2 ideas that were at the heart of his liberal beliefs. One is the supremacy of individual expression, in other words, the artist's right to a personal style. And 2, the continuity of representational depiction. Broadening his range, but never abandoning his belief in the supremacy of individual expression, Phillips wrote in 1931 that my own special function is to find the independent artist and to stand sponsor for him against the herd mind. I also pride myself on making a record of the many phases of artistic expression which are open to the modern painter. Kandinsky took longer for Phillips to embrace. Trained as a lawyer, the Russian Kandinsky seemed too cerebral and not emotive enough for Phillips. But 2 examples finally entered the collection in 1944 and 1945. One, a Paris painting from 1935 Succession that you see on the right, and the second, Autumn 2, a pre-war landscape from 1912. The expressive qualities of each are brought together by color, confirming once again the central role of color in Phillips' modernist aesthetic. And so you all have the wonderful pleasure of seeing all 3 of our Kandinskys here at the Kimbell. Now, Phillips never lost his enthusiasm for younger artists in the post-war years, continuing the search for new talent, works of quality and distinction throughout the 50s and 60s with the same adventurous spirit as before. Many working European artists found the Phillips Collection to be a welcoming American museum in the post-war period. The Russian-born French artist Nicolas de Staël, for example, has been an important artist in the Phillips modern pantheon since 1950, when Duncan Phillips first saw the artist's work in the back of a station wagon owned by the dealer Theodore Schempp, who came calling to the Phillips directly and knocked on the door and said, "Duncan, I think I have some things you might be interested in." Responding to de Staël's distinctive pictorial language of rhythmic patches of color and abstract harmonies, Phillips immediately bought the first of 8 de Staëls, making the Phillips Collection the first American museum to acquire the artist's work. And in 1953, Phillips gave the artist his first solo museum exhibition. Post-war British art also became a favorite of Phillips in the 40s and 50s, especially the work of Ben Nicholson, a pioneer of British abstraction. 5 of the 6 works by Nicholson in the collection date to between 1940 and 1955, an era that saw the resurgence of Nicholson's confrontation with landscape and his effort to synthesize the lessons of Mondrian and Cubism. It is not known when Phillips first encountered Nicholson's work, but in 1951, Phillips hosted the artist's first solo exhibition at a U.S. museum. Duncan Phillips and Marjorie's interest in Henry Moore's work coalesced in 1946. Marjorie was actually the one who was more interested in sculpture than Duncan was. And in 1946, the Phillips Collection gave Moore his first museum exhibition in America, 9 months prior to his first American retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. The Phillipses made their first purchase of a work by Moore at that time, purchasing the work that you see, Family Group, and it is in the exhibition here. From 1948 to 1968, Family Group was on near constant view at the Phillips Collection, where it served as the centerpiece for the British paintings unit that Phillips assembled. Now, in the mid-1950s, Duncan Phillips was one of many American collectors who took an interest in the still lifes of Giorgio Morandi, whose work had been introduced to American audiences in a 1949 Museum of Modern Art exhibition that was devoted to 20th century Italian art. Phillips purchased 2 still lifes by Morandi, the first in 1954, the one you see on the right that is in the exhibition here. A second, this kind of beautiful white one on the left, was acquired in 1957. That is the year that the Phillips Collection gave Morandi his first solo museum show in a U.S. museum. By the late 1950s, the large-sized canvases that were favored by post-war artists, together with the increasing growth of the collection as a whole, spurred Phillips, who was then in his mid-70s, to initiate the construction of another building for the museum that would be joined to the house. The annex, as it came to be known, opened to the public in 1960s, and its galleries were planned to echo the scale and feel of the original house. And here on the right, it is this very international-looking structure that is so distinct from the brick building next to it. The new addition allowed Phillips the opportunity to create a separate room for Mark Rothko's painting, which he had begun to collect in 1957. Phillips was uniquely disposed to make a permanent and immersive environment for Rothko's work, as he had already established the clay room and had envisioned rooms dedicated to different artists from the very beginning of his museum project. The Rothko room opened with the new annex in 1960, and it is the first permanent installation of Rothko's work as a separate group. It set the standard for displaying Rothko's work, and it remains a signature of the museum today. The new annex also allowed Phillips more opportunities to experiment with sculpture. Duncan and Marjorie Phillips' interest in Giacometti predated the surge of attention by American museums in the late 1960s. They considered Giacometti to be one of the most distinguished contemporary sculptors who found his own originality, believing his heads to be monumental tributes to the average man. After purchasing the monumental head that you see in the exhibition in 1962, the Phillipses decided to hold a major exhibition of Giacometti's work. It was organized by Marjorie, who considered it to be one of the museum's most significant shows. The Giacometti sculpture was always on permanent view during Duncan and Marjorie's lifetimes and rarely loaned, and it is with great pride that we include it in the exhibition here at the Kimbell. So now to conclude, I'm sure you're glad, let me summarize a few points. Duncan Phillips assembled a collection of modern painting at the end of World War I, when there were no roadmaps for what would stand the test of time. When he died in 1966, the collection numbered nearly 2,000 works, with approximately 400 or more European works and more than 1,400 American works. He collected works that were important on their merits, not because they illustrated schools of thought, were faddish, or were by famous names. He was interested in connections between works of art and willing to take risks by supporting young artists of diverse aesthetic temperaments. He never collected art to reassure his own taste. He believed the true artists would change him, and so they did. His collection and museum evolved in tune with the uncertainties and diversities of the 20th century. It is a tribute to Phillips' own open mind, as well as his passion for art, that he continued to actively add works to the collection right up until his death in 1966 at age 79. The result is an exceptionally unified collection that perfectly reflects the evolution of Phillips' eye and taste over the course of 50 years. A collection in which the whole is a work of art in itself. In 1965, a year before his death, Phillips wrote of his wishes for the museum's future, expressing his hope that it would not change too much from his conception of it as a home for the arts where people would feel close to the work. Duncan Phillips did not believe the collection he assembled was a closed one that could never be added to or changed. He gave permission to those who would lead his museum into the future to continue the experiment while respecting the aesthetic unity of the collection he had assembled. So now in the 21st century, the Phillips Collection continues its mission as a small, intimate museum combined with an experiment station, a vision for the future laid out nearly 100 years ago that provides us with a roadmap today. And so thank you all very much.